Why did Rome's armies choose to wipe an entire kingdom from the map in a single night? What force drove disciplined legions, men drilled into hardened machines of war, to commit an act so ruthless that even centuries later, historians still marvel at the cold efficiency? This isn't just the story of conquest. It's the story of an empire announcing to the world that resistance was futile, that kingdoms could vanish in the time it took for dawn to break. The year was 106 CE. At the height of its territorial power, Rome had already swallowed Greece, Carthage, Gaul, and portions of the east. Yet a formidable enemy still stood across the Danube River, the proud kingdom of Dacia, ruled by a stubborn and brilliant leader, King Decebalus. The Dacians were no primitive rabble. They had fortresses tucked into forested mountains. They wielded their wickedly curved falx blades with devastating precision, and they had already humiliated Roman forces in previous battles. For Trajan, Rome's emperor, this was more than about acquisition. This was about revenge, honor, and demonstrating to every tribe along Rome's frontiers that defiance meant annihilation. Consider what was at stake. Rome's entire image as the indomitable superpower depended on maintaining fear at its borders. If a kingdom like Dacia could score victories and remain independent, what message would that send to restless Gauls, to the Germanic tribes hovering along the Rhine, or to Parthian courts in the east? Trajan's predecessors had tolerated this thorn on the empire's edge. Trajan would not. For him, this was more than a border skirmish. This was about breaking the will of potential challengers across Europe. Unknown to most at the time, the campaign against Dacia was not just another conquest for plunder and territory. It was a calculated demonstration, a warning carved into mountainsides and burned into the memories of those who might dare resist. And the method by which Trajan chose to achieve this message reveals the unique ruthlessness of the Roman military machine. Strategically, Trajan understood geography as few leaders of his day did. The Danube River was not simply a waterway, it was the frontier line, a living barrier. No Roman army could have crossed it without immense logistical preparation. But Trajan invested resources on a staggering scale. He ordered the construction of the longest bridge ever built in the ancient world, a feat so daring that it itself was an act of intimidation. Spanning more than a kilometer, it wasn't merely a way into Dacia, it was a declaration. Rome could bend nature for military purposes. Archaeological evidence still shows the piers of this structure, silent ruins that testify to Roman audacity. Now, what was the Dacian kingdom that justified such effort? Unlike some tribal societies that Rome dismissed as disorganized, Dacia had a coherent monarchy, a centralized authority, and formidable defensive works in the Orostia Mountains. These mountain fortresses were not crude palisades. They contained stone walls layered in a unique system of construction that baffled Roman engineers. Decebalus himself had wit, charisma, and a gift for reuniting fractious noble families. Far from a minor obstacle, Dacia presented itself as an equal in political willpower, if not resources. Here lies the critical tension. Trajan's Rome prided itself on rational expansion, but this war was intensely personal. Decebalus had humiliated Romans under Domitian, forcing them to pay tribute, an unthinkable disgrace. To allow that reputation of weakness to linger threatened the very mythology of Rome. Trajan, determined to erase this shame whether through diplomacy or annihilation, focused on what Rome did best: overwhelming manpower, ruthless engineering, and the discipline of its legions. But what exactly made these legions such a terror to kingdoms like Dacia? It was not merely superior weaponry. Rome's true weapon was predictability, the cold certainty of repeated methods that no opponent could break. Whereas barbarian kings often relied on ambush or on desperate charges down a hillside, Roman generals relied on structures, literally and metaphorically. Before engaging an enemy, legions built fortified camps each night. These weren't scattered tents, but miniature cities, with ditches, ramparts, gates oriented at precise angles. Every soldier knew his task. Every soldier took confidence in the orderly progression of their daily warmaking. For a Dacian warrior, looking down from a hilltop and seeing camps spring up instantly conveyed hopelessness. This wasn't a temporary raid. It was machinery grinding forward. At the personal level, imagine being a legionary in this campaign. You've marched 20 miles with full kit, armor, weapons, shields, supplies, perhaps 27 kilograms weighing on your back. At camp, you're ordered to dig ditches in rocky earth until your hands bleed. You eat coarse bread and watered wine. You wrap yourself in a rough cloak for warmth. The reward? The promise that after 16 or more years of service, land might be granted to you on conquered soil. These men weren't faceless machines. They were humans holding private hopes. A farm one day, a legacy for their sons, maybe just the relief of survival. Yet those ambitions were harnessed to construct a machine that erased kingdoms. Strategically, Trajan emphasized patience. He wasn't in a rush for empty glory. Unlike Decebalus, who needed rapid symbolic victories to hold his coalition together, Trajan understood empire as a marathon. By bridging the Danube, by supplying his armies efficiently, he ensured that the confrontation would be fought on Roman terms. But what if you were Decebalus, standing at your mountain stronghold? You've resisted for more than a decade. You've seen your warriors triumph once against Domitian's incompetence. You wield the loyalty of your people by convincing them Rome can be fought. Yet as you watch arch after arch rise across the Danube, you know you're facing something different. The enemy isn't gambling on luck. They're planning to consume your kingdom systematically. Here we see one of the greatest contrasts between Roman and barbarian strategy. Rome thrived on cumulative pressure. Where tribal powers demanded immediate morale-boosting wins, Rome wore you down relentlessly. Siege after siege, supply line cut, ambush punished, even winners endured without retreating. And when the final blow came, it was not sudden chance. It was the inevitable conclusion of incremental grinding. Viewers today may wonder, why did Decebalus not simply submit and negotiate favorable terms? After all, many kingdoms had survived under Roman friendship, as client states. The answer lies in pride, but also practicality. By resisting, Decebalus remained king. To surrender meant becoming a puppet, losing dignity, and potentially his own head. Between a humiliating but safe compromise and heroic but doomed resistance, he chose the latter. This personal decision would become the prelude to absolute disaster. And thus, we prepare for the climax of this story, the night when an entire kingdom was extinguished. Archaeological traces reveal burnt fortifications near the Dacian capital of Sarmizegetusa, treasure hoards hurriedly buried in rivers, and mass graves of warriors felled by the disciplined advance of legionaries. The evidence suggests not slow assimilation, but sudden obliteration. Rome intended a lesson, not a treaty. Here's the tactical question to consider. If you were in Trajan's sandals, would you have pursued the eradication of a defiant people at all costs? Or would you have sought a client-king compromise? That choice, in many ways, defines empire itself. Do you conquer to expand wealth or conquer to terrify? What made this campaign unforgettable was not that Rome won often. It was the manner of the victory, the immediacy with which a proud kingdom's sovereignty disappeared. Rome would use this triumph as propaganda back in the Forum, carving every detail onto Trajan's column, where spiraling stone narratives turned bloody battles into immortal marble lessons. But behind the propaganda was violence, fire, and the quiet terror of men who realized their world was vanishing into history books written by their enemies. And as Trajan marched back into Rome with Dacian gold, slaves, and stories of supreme ruthlessness, senators and generals began whispering, if an emperor could erase kingdoms so swiftly, what could prevent him from erasing rivals back home? That tension between triumph abroad and uncertainty in Rome itself sets the stage for our deeper exploration of how Rome's military machine, discipline, and sheer ferocity shaped not only battles but politics, society, and eventually the empire's destiny. And now, as we shift into examining the Roman military machine itself, understand this. The erasure of Dacia overnight was not an accident of fortune. It was the product of a system, ruthless, efficient, and disturbingly impersonal. The greatest army on earth was not merely fighting battles. It was practicing the science of endurance, engineering, and psychological domination. Why did Rome's legions consistently outfight enemies across 3 continents? Was it their weapons, their discipline, or perhaps something deeper, a system that crushed individuality in exchange for collective invincibility? Military historians have long examined why a force of mostly farmers, craftsmen, and conscripts could stand unshaken against howling tribal charges and the chariots of Eastern kings. The answer lies in the very structure of the Roman legion, an organism as complex as any modern military unit, designed not for brilliance of individuals, but for the terrifying power of the group. Imagine the battlefield from a barbarian perspective. Across the valley stand not simple men, but blocks of soldiers, arranged in perfect lines. Helmets glint in the sun, rectangular shields overlap into an unbroken wall, and when the centurion blows his whistle, every foot strikes the ground in unison. This wasn't war as the ancients knew it. This was the sound of discipline attempting to erase chaos. At the heart of the system was organization. A legion was divided into 10 cohorts, each composed of 6 centuries, with roughly 80 men per century. These centuries weren't just arbitrary labels. They were tactical subunits that allowed Rome to break a massive army into small, maneuverable blocks. Unlike the older Greek phalanx, with its unwieldy wall of spears, the Roman system combined stability with flexibility. When one unit faltered, another could pivot. When an enemy flank opened, centuries could surge forward without compromising the entire formation. Why was this important? Because Rome understood a fundamental truth of warfare. Battles aren't won by raw courage. They're won by endurance, the ability to stay organized when fear grips every nerve. Most tribal armies relied on courage and the charisma of a single king or warlord. But charisma dies quickly as soon as a sword slices through the leader. Rome built an army that could keep functioning even after commanders fell. Centurions enforced discipline like unyielding machines, ensuring the body of the legion stayed coherent even if its head was cut off. And what of the famous training regimen that forged these men? To call it grueling is an understatement. Recruits were forced to march 20 miles under the weight of armor, rations, and equipment, packed so heavy that later generations referred to them as Marius's mules, after the general who institutionalized such burdens. Soldiers drilled with wooden swords and shields that were deliberately heavier than the real thing, so that combat felt easier than practice. Ditches were dug, palisades raised, walls climbed, formations practiced endlessly in fields outside camp. Most importantly, discipline wasn't optional. It was enforced through fear. Centurions carried the vitis, a vine staff used not for ceremony but for beating soldiers into line. Desertion meant execution, sometimes by decimation, the grisly practice of killing 1 in every 10 soldiers of a disgraced unit. Imagine that psychological effect. Watching your comrades draw lots to see who must die because the group failed. No tribal warband, however brave, had an equivalent mechanism for enforcing cohesion. But structure alone doesn't win a battle. Weapons matter too. The pilum, Rome's infamous throwing spear, was a marvel not just of metallurgy but of psychological warfare. Designed with a soft iron shank, it bent on impact so it couldn't be thrown back by the enemy. Worse still, if it lodged in a shield, the weighted shaft dragged the shield down, rendering it useless. Archaeological finds show many shields punctured by pila, discarded and abandoned in panic. Soldiers robbed of their shields quickly lost the will to charge against the wall of Roman blades. Then there was the gladius, short and unimpressive at first glance, but devastating in trained hands. Tribal warriors wielded long swords meant for sweeping, slashing strokes, a style that looked fearsome in a frenzy of hacking. The gladius, however, was designed for stabbing. Compact, efficient, lethal within the narrow spaces of shield formations, it turned battles into grim, bloody affairs where professionalism won over rage. And of course, the testudo, or tortoise formation. Shields locked above and on the sides created an armored shell that advanced implacably, arrows skittering off in futility. Imagine yourself as a Dacian archer raining shafts from your wooden walls, only to watch them patter harmlessly against overlapping shields while the formation grinds forward with terrifying inevitability. The Romans didn't just design weapons for battlefields, they optimized their logistics for campaigns. Every legion traveled like an army of engineers. Camps weren't tents randomly hammered into ground. They were fortified mini-cities laid out with mathematical precision: walls, gates, streets, command tents, storage pits. This gave Rome two advantages. First, morale. Soldiers felt protected and structured even in enemy lands. Second, intimidation. Locals peering down at these nightly fortresses realized Rome didn't come as raiders. They came as permanent occupiers. One of the most impressive tactics was Rome's standardization of supply lines. Roads built not for local convenience, but for military necessity, snaked across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. These roads allowed messages to fly faster than any barbarian scout could comprehend. Oxen-drawn wagons rolled forward with grain, weapons, and reinforcements. Rome understood that men rarely lose from lack of courage, but they always lose when their stomachs are empty. Behind this seemingly invulnerable wall of steel, however, were ordinary lives. A soldier rose before dawn, checked his kit on punishment of flogging, cleaned his armor, and prepared for orders. He might gamble with dice in his downtime, send letters scratched onto wax tablets, or sneak illicit drinks of stronger wine reserved for officers. He might whisper about the wife and children left behind, or dream of the land he'd be granted after years of service. Soberingly, many soldiers never lived to see that promised future, though their sacrifices built the empire brick by brick. Now consider the Romans from their enemies' perspective again. To a Gaul or Dacian, their courage wasn't in doubt, but once battle began, they faced relentless coordination impossible to match. When the first wave of warriors crashed into the Roman line, the shields didn't budge. Pilum disabled the front rank. A commander's horn sounded, sentries wheeled, and flankers stabbed into now exposed sides. Courage evaporated quickly when order met disorder. And still, Rome wasn't invincible. They suffered defeats, disastrous ones at times. The Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE annihilated 3 whole legions. Parthian horse archers humiliated even the mighty Crassus. But the point lies in resilience. Rome could endure catastrophe, absorb it, rebuild, and march forward again with renewed discipline. No tribal kingdom could recover with the same speed or consistency. Archaeology confirms the systematic nature of this machine. All across former Roman territories, remnants of marching camps follow mathematical blueprints nearly identical, whether in Germany, Britain, or Dacia. Signature nails once used for legionary sandals litter ancient fields. Even the fragments of broken pala heads confirm their design bending. This uniformity wasn't coincidence. It was the product of a state married to militarization. So we must ask, was this simply military brilliance, or was it a ruthless cultural philosophy that erased individuality for the sake of order? Rome demanded submission not merely of conquered peoples, but of its own soldiers. The reward was glory, survival, and the illusion of immortality. The cost was obedience, sometimes unto death. For Trajan's Dacian wars, this machine was critical. Barbarians might ambush, raid, or even occasionally win, but the legion did not collapse from panic. While Decebalus relied on fiery speeches, Trajan relied on the certainty that his legions could perform maneuvers soberly, mechanically, again and again, until the Dacian system dissolved. Consider for a moment, if you faced such a machine commanding a fragile tribal coalition, what would you have done? Sought terms? Tried endless guerrilla raids? Or charged, praying for a lucky break against formations designed to deny luck itself? And from this understanding of Rome's unparalleled military system, we transition to the critical test of its capabilities, a battle that would determine whether the machine could crush not just armies, but extinguish an entire kingdom in one stroke. The clash with Dacia was not just empire versus tribe. It was system versus spirit, iron discipline versus desperate courage. The question was not whether Rome could win battles, it was whether they could end a nation overnight. Why would Rome's emperor commit such staggering resources to crushing a kingdom tucked into the Carpathian Mountains? Why risk tens of thousands of soldiers, weeks of engineering, and the stability of supply lines stretched across a river frontier? The answer lies in what followed: the decisive clash between Trajan's legions and the Dacian kingdom, a confrontation so complete that by the end of it, Dacia ceased to exist as an independent power. The campaign reached its climax in 105-106 CE, when Trajan resolved to storm the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa. This wasn't a mere raid, it was a calculated strike at the heart of the kingdom, an attempt to sever its head in one crushing action. Decebalus had spent prior years fortifying his homeland with stone walls and mountain redoubts connected by clever defenses. Archaeological surveys reveal layers of terraces and fortifications deliberately designed to slow Roman advances. Yet the very predictability that had allowed Decebalus to rally his people also betrayed him. By gathering his strength in the mountains, he gave Trajan a single, identifiable target. Tactically, the Romans began not with cavalry charges or reckless thrusts, but with ruthless engineering. Supply lines stretched back across the Danube Bridge allowed Trajan to feed, clothe, and arm his men without fear of starvation. The legions marched in relentless order, constructing fortified camps each night as they edged closer to the Dacian heartland. For weeks, skirmishes flared in forests and mountain passes. Dacian warriors, wielding their iconic falques, curved blades capable of cleaving through Roman helmets, sprang ambushes in narrow valleys, cutting down patrols and disappearing into the woods. Roman casualties were real, the sense of danger constant, but the machine never stalled. Camps rose, roads carved, bridges rebuilt after sabotage. Consider the psychological contrast. For a Dacian fighter, each ambush was a gamble fueled by courage. Success gave fleeting morale. Failure meant annihilation. For the Romans, each night's camp was a quiet reassurance of permanence, a reminder that tomorrow would be another step inexorably forward. This was war as pressure, not as gamble. When the legions finally erupted into the vicinity of Sarmizegetusa, Trajan himself took command of preparations for the siege. Archaeology reveals what the Romans did. They cut the city's water supply by diverting aqueducts, methodically starving defenders of their most vital resource. Siege engines hurled stones and incendiaries against the walls. Legionaries formed testudos that advanced under thick arrow fire. Dacian counterattacks attempted to break the siege lines, but Roman cohorts rotated fresh troops forward, while exhausted men slipped back to regroup, a system of sustained pressure no tribal host could emulate. Yet this wasn't simply an engineering puzzle. The human stakes were gripping. Inside the fortress, Decebalus faced a people exhausted by years of war. Food supplies dwindled. Morale withered as the aqueducts ran dry. He could not abandon the fortress without conceding defeat. Yet remaining meant facing encirclement, starvation, and inevitable slaughter. At this moment, the Dacian king's personal charisma mattered more than ever. Accounts suggest he promised deliverance, attempted daring breakout raids, and launched final charges against Roman lines. These attacks caused real danger. Legionaries in the forward trenches were hacked apart by falx-wielding warriors. Roman helmets, torn by the curved blades, testify to how deadly those weapons were in close quarters. But again, discipline told the difference. A century of 80 men could absorb losses, regroup, and keep formation. A Dacian warband, once its leader fell, dissolved in confusion. Trajan's greatest weapon was this iron law of coherence. Every Roman soldier knew his position, his duty, his commander. Every Dacian warrior knew only loyalty to his king, and loyalty dissolves when blood drains into the dirt at your feet. The siege reached its breaking point when the Romans fully severed Sarmizegetusa's water. Contemporary accounts describe desperate thirst gripping the defenders. Fires raged from incendiary stones. Dacian warriors attempted one last mass assault on Roman lines, but were beaten back with staggering losses. The city fell swiftly thereafter. Rome entered, looting and tearing down fortifications. Hordes of Dacian treasure, hurriedly hidden in rivers and under fort walls, were captured. The kingdom's very lifeblood, its leadership, its culture, its pride, was extinguished in one brutal climax. But the real drama centered on Decebalus himself. Refusing to allow the humiliation of capture, the king mounted a horse and fled through forests, pursued by Roman cavalry. Cornered, he drew a dagger and ended his life rather than be paraded in chains through Rome's streets. Archaeological excavations in modern Romania have unearthed statues believed to represent his image. Proud, defiant, a leader remembered even in defeat for his refusal to bow. Yet his death was more than an act of dignity. It was the symbolic erasure of Dacian sovereignty at a single stroke. What made this annihilation so shocking wasn't merely the bloodshed. Rome had waged cruel wars before. What was unusual was the sudden transformation of Dacia from rival state into Roman province almost overnight. The efficiency demonstrates the strategic superiority of Rome's blend of engineering, logistics, and discipline. The battlefield wasn't a place of random heroism, it was a stage on which system obliterated spirit. Let's pause for an analytical angle. Why was the fall of Sarmizegetusa so decisive compared to other Roman conquests? Hispania resisted for centuries, as did parts of Gaul. The difference was Rome's learned resolve. Unlike past emperors who might seek tribute or half measures, Trajan intended nothing short of eradication. He brought enough legions to make negotiation unnecessary. He directed operations personally, ensuring no hesitant general could squander momentum. And critically, he blended tactical patience with overwhelming violence, starving the enemy while simultaneously battering them into panic. The combination left no space for compromise. Now put yourself in the sandals of a Roman legionary at the final assault. You advance under arrow fire, shield interlocked with the man next to you. Siege towers rumble forward behind iron-bound wheels. Stones crash from the heavens, slamming into walls. Suddenly the aqueduct bursts. Spilling dust and rubble, cheers erupt as defenders realize their water is gone. You march upward, step after grueling step, breath boiling under your helmet, until you stand atop the fallen ramparts. In that moment you know, you haven't just taken a city, you've ended a kingdom. This victory had consequences that rippled beyond the battlefield. For Rome, the capture of Dacia provided staggering wealth. Mines rich in gold and silver fell directly into imperial hands, so plentiful that the flood of bullion disrupted Rome's economy. Trajan used the spoils to build monuments that still stand. Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Column, grand expansions of infrastructure that made his reign remembered as Rome's golden era. Archaeological evidence of Dacian gold dispersed across Roman territories confirms this sudden influx. For the Dacians, however, the consequences were annihilation. Freedmen were enslaved, communities broken, families scattered across the empire as cheap labor. Their culture, recorded in only fragments, largely vanished from history. Yes, traces remain, in place names, in linguistic echoes, in ruins dug from Romanian hillsides. But as a sovereign people, the Dacians were erased in a single season of campaigning. This was genocide conducted with military efficiency, justified in the language of empire, and celebrated as glory. From a military strategist's view, what stands out is Trajan's dual ability to adopt relentless patience and sudden brutality. He exemplified Rome's genius: prepare meticulously, then strike with overwhelming force when the time comes. Modern commanders might take note. The patient prelude of engineering and encirclement ensured the final clash was fought on Rome's terms, not the enemy's. And yet, this same thoroughness sowed dangers for Rome itself. By celebrating such overwhelming conquests, by demonstrating that resistance would mean eradication, the empire pushed its frontiers and obligations further than ever before. Control of Dacia required garrisons, roads, integration, a constant drain. That cost, first hidden beneath the glitter of gold, would emerge in time as a deadly consequence of Roman martial success. If you were Trajan, would you have stopped short of conquest, content with a tributary king paying annual homage? Or would you have done what he did, demanding total submission, at a cost both to your soldiers and to Rome's long-term stability? History reveals his choice, but posing the question sharpens the lesson. Conquest is simple. Control is difficult, and annihilation creates as many problems as it solves. The valley of Sarmizegetusa fell silent after the siege. Smoke curled from smashed fortresses. Roman standards planted on captured walls announced final victory. The kingdom of Dacia ended that day. What began as a rival on the empire's frontier finished as a province inscribed onto Roman maps. And yet, even in ruin, the memory of Dacian resistance mattered. Trajan's column immortalized them with surprising respect, their warriors carved as noble adversaries. In this paradox, brutal erasure yet admiring depiction, we glimpse Rome's complicated relationship with its enemies. ruthless in conquest, but quietly reverent of valor. As Trajan returned home, hailed as Optimus Princeps, the best of emperors, senators debated the meaning of the victory. Some saw wealth and glory. Others whispered that by erasing a kingdom so swiftly, Rome had set itself on a dangerous path of appetites too vast to satisfy. Greater power meant greater instability. Triumph abroad always stirred intrigue at home. And so, behind the golden triumph of Dacia lay the shadows of political turmoil, the stage for our next chapter, the treacherous world of Roman politics, where rivalries and ambitions threatened to undermine even the greatest military victories. Why is it that some of Rome's greatest military triumphs planted the seeds of unrest back home? Why should the obliteration of a foreign enemy, an achievement that poured wealth and prestige into the empire, end up unsettling the very Senate that cheered for victory? The answer lies in Rome's dual nature. It was both a war machine and a political theater. Glory on the battlefield didn't exist in a vacuum. It reverberated through the aristocracy, shaken by ambition, jealousy, and the whisper of daggers in dark corridors. When Trajan turned triumphant from Dacia, hailed as a conqueror without equal, he believed the empire had entered a golden age. Gold and silver from the captured mines of the Carpathians flowed into Rome in such quantities that wages rose, monuments sprouted, and the Forum gleamed with new marble. Trajan's column, still spiraling proudly today, immortalized the Dacian wars in stone reliefs. Roman soldiers advancing in precise order, Dacian warriors depicted as noble, but doomed. The people adored him for it. The streets erupted in triumphal celebrations, bread and games distributed generously. From the perspective of the plebeian masses, Trajan seemed invincible, a soldier emperor who embodied all that Rome idolized. But inside the Senate, admiration was tinged with fear. Senators whispered behind closed doors, what happens when a general commands not only the loyalty of the people, but the worship of his legions? What happens when wealth unprecedented in recent memory ceases to circulate under aristocratic control and instead flows directly through imperial coffers? In Rome, victory abroad could create enemies at home faster than defeats ever could. We must remember that the Senate was not a neutral body of advisors. It was a collection of rival noble families, bound together by status, but divided by ambition. Each senator knew that the glory of one man diminished the stature of others, and Trajan's overwhelming success threatened to cast the entire Senate into shadow. Consider their dilemma. Trajan had broken Dacia utterly. An entire kingdom, and with it its royal treasury, now lay at the emperor's feet. Could any senator claim with a straight face to rival him in glory or influence? Even as their mouths cheered, their minds calculated survival in a Rome where power was concentrating frighteningly close to the imperial throne. Political intrigue took many forms. Some chose flattery, hoping to bask in reflected glory. Senators commissioned statues, offered public praises, and aligned their names with Trajan's Dacian spoils. Others sharpened their criticisms in private, complaining about the dangerous precedent. Was Rome meant to annihilate every opponent? What of the coins? Maintaining Dacia as a province required a permanent garrison, new roads, and endless administrative oversight. Gold could line Rome's coffers today, but it also destabilized the economy, creating inflation and corruption. To understand these murmurings, we must step into the mind of a senator, a man conditioned to believe in the collective sovereignty of Rome's elite. He had watched emperors rise and fall, many assassinated. He knew that glory was both crown and dagger. Too much and the Senate resented you. Too little and the army abandoned you. Trajan's overwhelming success was precisely the sort of imbalance that bred deadly conspiracies. So whispers began. Could one man hold so much power indefinitely? Should safeguards be placed? Was the Senate to remain relevant, or was it becoming a rubber stamp for imperial decisions? Here we see the paradox. Rome's military machine could erase kingdoms abroad, but its internal politics remained as fractious and dangerous as ever. Cicero once wrote that Rome had two republics, the one abroad and the one at home. Abroad, Rome projected unity and terrifying strength. At home, bitter rivalries gnawed from within. Although the republic itself had long yielded to the principate, the psychology remained. Every senator thought himself a potential kingmaker, if not an emperor in waiting. What of assassination plots? History is littered with examples. Caesar fell to daggers in the Senate when his power grew intolerable. Caligula was cut down by conspirators within the Praetorian Guard. Domitian, only a generation earlier, had been murdered in his own palace. Trajan, though immensely popular, was not immune. Every triumphal procession back into Rome carried the silent risk that envy, not foreign enemies, might shorten an emperor's reign. Archaeological fragments of letters and inscriptions hint at how propaganda was mobilized at this moment. Senators tried to reframe the narrative, painting Trajan as a servant of the Senate rather than a master over it. Coins minted with his image often bore inscriptions linking him with traditional Republican virtues. Optimus Princeps, the best of leaders, not a tyrant. This careful balancing reassured the aristocracy even as they struggled privately to accept his dominance. But Trajan himself was a strategist. Just as he outmaneuvered Decebalus through patience and pressure, he handled Roman politics with subtle calculation. Instead of crushing the Senate, he courted it. He invited senators on campaigns, gave them honorary commands, and distributed Dacian wealth through public works like markets, baths, and forums. This wasn't generosity alone. It was strategy, the dispersal of resources to minimize jealousy, the symbolic gift of spoils to make senators feel included in the victory narrative. Of course, not all were so easily swayed. Ancient sources allude to rivalries among ambitious men who felt eclipsed. Some advocated against further expansion, warning that Dacia was a golden trap, a conquest that seemed rich but would bleed Rome's resources long-term. Others muttered that Trajan's reliance on the army for legitimacy risked turning the Praetorian Guard into political kingmakers, as they had been under earlier emperors. To understand the stakes, think of Rome as a seesaw balanced on two fulcrums, the army and the Senate. Tilt too far toward the Senate, and generals fear for loyalty of soldiers. Tilt too far toward the army, and senators conspire to cut you down. Trajan's brilliance, at least in this phase, was maintaining equilibrium. He kept the army grateful and the Senate included, yet this balance was precarious and only as stable as his continued military success. Consider a viewer's challenge, Bung. If you were a senator in 106 CE, what would your move have been? Align openly with Trajan, risking that his star might fade and drag you down? Or secretly conspire to weaken him, hoping to reclaim senatorial dominance? Each option carried lethal consequences. This was the chessboard of Roman politics, played not with pawns but with legions and lives. Beyond the Senate, the urban mob also factored into politics. Victories satiated the crowd, gladiatorial games expanded, bread distributions grew more generous. But mobs are fickle. Just as they cheered Trajan's triumph, they could turn against senators perceived as hindering the flow of wealth. Public opinion was a weapon as sharp as any sword, manipulated through spectacles funded by Dacian spoils. In this way, conquest abroad reshaped not only imperial coffers, but the very moods of Rome's restless population. Yet politics was not only about who ruled, but about what Rome became. The obliteration of Dacia sparked philosophical debate. Was Rome still a city of laws, or had it evolved into an empire of steel? Traditionalists worried that the reliance on annihilation rather than diplomacy undermined Rome's heritage as a state of measured governance. Pragmatists countered that fear was more useful than compromise. Trajan's victory was thus reframed as a broader question. Was Rome's destiny to rule through assimilation or domination? And here we note a critical irony. The very Senate that grumbled about lost influence also enjoyed the spoils. Senators received contracts to exploit Dacian mines. They profited from slave markets suddenly filled with Dacian captives. Many built villas adorned with gold leaf drawn from Carpathian earth. Their outrage, then, was double-edged, rooted as much in envy as in principle. This duplicity is visible in surviving accounts. Writers praise Trajan's virtues while carefully inserting caveats about the dangers of excessive conquest. It is the language of political survival. Honor the victor, but leave yourself room to criticize later, should tides turn. Even in the highest echelons of Rome, few words were spoken without calculation. For Trajan, the clearest threat was not one bold plotter, but the slow erosion of senatorial loyalty. History shows that regimes do not collapse from a single blow, but from accumulated whispers. An ally absent from the Senate one day, a delay in funds the next. Disaffection spreads silently until, when crisis comes, no one rushes to defend the emperor. Trajan, however, sidestepped this fate in his lifetime, avoiding open conspiracies through careful political choreography. But the tragedy is this: his triumph planted precedents. Future emperors with less skill attempted to replicate his methods, erasing enemies abroad, overwhelming the Senate with charisma and loot, without balancing the scales. For them, envy turned lethal, and halls once echoing with polite applause rang instead with steel. The lesson then is that military power and political power are never separate. Each Roman victory abroad was a move in the dangerous game at home. Trajan's conquest of Dacia illustrates the paradox perfectly. Absolute annihilation of an enemy became inspiration for subtle daggers in Rome itself. And so, as we leave the Senate chambers and whispering corridors, we must consider, was conquest truly a blessing for Rome, or a poisoned chalice that fed instability the more it seemed to succeed? In the answer to that question lies the beginning of Rome's long transformation from an invincible empire into a restless giant straining under the weight of its own victories. What follows next, then, is how such conquest didn't just shape politics, but lives of soldiers in far-flung camps, of conquered peoples struggling to survive, of ordinary citizens dazzled by wealth but shackled by dependence. The cultural impact of Roman expansion and the daily rhythms of those who lived under its shadow tell us the human cost behind both battlefield and Senate intrigue. Why do empires fight wars? Is it for the glory of victory, the safety of borders, or the personal ambition of leaders? Rome fought for all these reasons, but its wars transformed cultures as much as they transformed maps. The conquest of Dacia wasn't only a clash of swords, it was a collision of worlds. And the ripples of that collision reached deep into everyday routines, for Romans and for the conquered alike. When Trajan declared victory, Rome gained more than a province. It absorbed people, traditions, and resources into its imperial bloodstream. Dacia's gold, silver, and fertile lands were now Roman assets, but assets must be managed. Soldiers were left to garrison the new territory. Administrators imposed the Latin language. Colonists arrived, planning Roman towns upon villages that only weeks before had called themselves sovereign. Overnight, the rhythms of life for both conqueror and conquered shifted. For the Dacians who survived, the transformation was overwhelming. Armies had burned fortresses, enslaved thousands, and seized farmland. Families were torn apart. Men marched away in chains to markets in Italy or North Africa. Women and children folded into slavery or servitude. Archaeological finds of shackles and hastily built Roman forts on Dacian soil confirmed the immediacy of control. What had been sacred spaces for Dacian rituals now echoed with the sound of Roman boots. Rome did not simply annihilate, it integrated. New Roman towns, colonii, sprang up on the bones of the Old Kingdom. Temples to Jupiter and Minerva replaced Dacian sanctuaries. Baths, forums, and amphitheaters were constructed with ruthless efficiency. Imagine being a Dacian child, walking through a marketplace lined with Roman arches, hearing Latin spoken in trade deals, watching legionaries in their polished armor as the enforcers of daily order. Within a single generation, Dacian identity began to dissolve into Romanitas, the culture of the empire. Tactically, this was as deliberate as any battlefield maneuver. Rome won not just by killing enemies, but by erasing difference. Latin, law, architecture, and citizenship burrowed into conquered spaces until resistance lost its shape. This was Rome's genius. It conquered through assimilation as much as annihilation. For the Roman soldier left behind in Dacia, life took another turn. Far from the glory of the siege at Sarmizegetusa, garrison duty was repetitive, grinding, and often miserable. A soldier spent long months patrolling roads or manning watchtowers in unfamiliar, sometimes hostile countryside. Letters discovered on wax tablets from soldiers posted in distant provinces, like Vindolanda on the far edge of Britain, reveal the same worries we can imagine in Dacia: shortages of food, boredom, harsh weather, and a yearning for home. Daily life followed a strict pattern. At dawn, soldiers mustered for roll call, tended equipment, and received assignments. Some repaired fortifications, others drilled new recruits, while others patrolled the mountains hunting for remnants of Dacian resistance. Meals were plain, barley porridge or bread, hard cheese, salted meat when available. Water was sour, so the soldiers diluted wine to make it safe. But beyond duty, there was leisure of a sort. Soldiers gambled with knucklebones and dice. They carved graffiti into walls, often crude but fascinating glimpses into humor, rivalry, and longing. Archaeological evidence of small altars in military camps shows soldiers making offerings to local gods alongside Jupiter, hedging their bets in unfamiliar lands. They wrote letters home complaining of officers or requesting socks and shoes, as vivid a reminder as any that while Rome was a machine, its cogs were profoundly human. Sociologically, Roman victories reinforced class divides. At the top, senators and equestrians enriched themselves by exploiting Dacian mines. Contracts to extract gold meant fortunes for Rome's wealthiest. For the middle classes of Italy and the provinces, Rome's victory brought cheaper goods, slaves to work farms, resources for trade. Yet the bottom levels bore a harsher price. Legionaries endured decades in isolated garrisons. Conquered peoples surrendered not only their freedom, but their identity. Slavery exponentialized. Markets flooded with Dacians sold as property. Imagine the life of one such enslaved Dacian woman in Rome. Torn from her mountain village, transported hundreds of miles, she now served in the kitchen of a senator. She may have glimpsed triumphal processions celebrating the conquest that had enslaved her. Her children, if she bore any, would be raised as Romans, speaking Latin, worshiping Roman gods. The personal tragedies of thousands like her are silent in our sources, but they form the foundation of Roman prosperity. Yet within this tragedy lies Rome's cultural strategy. The empire often extended citizenship, albeit gradually, to conquered peoples. Latin became the lingua franca, and Roman law standardized relations between individuals. Over time, conquered subjects often came to identify as Romans themselves. Generations melted into the marble mold of empire, forgetting their grandparents had once raised blades against legionaries. The cultural impact was also visible back in Rome. Victorious campaigns increased demand for spectacle. Dacian captives paraded through Rome, sometimes met their end in amphitheater games. Wild animals brought from conquered territories excited crowds who had grown hungry for novelty. Walls of Rome's houses displayed frescoes celebrating conquest, reinforcing the belief that empire was eternal and inevitable. Ordinary citizens consumed these displays without reflecting on the human cost. Much as modern societies often consume the products of distant, unseen exploitation. From a tactical historian's perspective, this cultural policy wasn't accidental. Rome understood that people don't resist indefinitely when assimilation offers benefits. Dacians who survived and adapted might secure Roman rights, access to markets, and security under imperial law. What Rome could not achieve through terror, it achieved through incentives. By drawing conquered peoples into its social fabric, it guaranteed longer-term stability. Daily life in Dacia became a study in contrasts. Roman military roads scarred the land, facilitating trade and supply, but they also enabled families to move, merchants to prosper, and local economies to grow. Roman baths appeared in towns, symbols of civility and structure. Amphitheaters introduced spectacles that mixed entertainment with imperial propaganda. Coins bore Trajan's portrait, reminding all who handled them who now sat supreme. A Dacian farmer, once offering tribute to his king, now paid taxes to an imperial collector. The collector might record his payment in Latin, further eroding ancestral traditions. Religion, too, shifted. Roman temples to Jupiter and Mars rose above conquered landscapes. Yet archaeology also reveals syncretism, locals carving their gods in hybrid forms, blending Roman and Dacian symbols. This shows the adaptability of cultures under imperial weight, where outright resistance failed, but subtle blending allowed some identity to survive. And let us return to the soldier, the man whose life was spent as the instrument of change. His cultural world expanded in conquest. He sampled foreign foods, learned new languages, sometimes married local women. His children, raised between Latin law and Dacian countryside, embodied the empire's spread. For him, the daily grind might seem trivial, But the cumulative effect was profound. He became not only Rome's defender, but also its agent of assimilation. But there's a darker undercurrent. Soldiers resented the endless campaigns. Many served not for glory, but because economic life at home offered little. Letters complain of delayed wages, cruel commanders, and false promises about land. The cultural impact, therefore, wasn't one of uniform pride, but of simmering discontent hidden beneath discipline. The glory celebrated in Rome's marble columns masked the boredom, suffering, and alienation etched into real lives. For civilians in Rome itself, the conquest reshaped their diets, their markets, their games. Cheap Dacian slaves undercut laborers, forcing free citizens into dependence on state distributions of grain and handouts. Victories poured wealth into elite hands, while ordinary Romans became more reliant on imperial largesse for survival. This dependency fostered a political culture where the emperor was expected to provide endless generosity, locking Rome into a cycle of constant conquest and costly appeasement at home. Strategically, that is the overlooked cost of conquest. Every victory raised expectations of more victories, more spoils, more games. Ordinary soldiers bore the grind of securing it, conquered peoples bore the cost of assimilation, and the urban Roman mob bore the debt of dependence. An empire could sustain this for centuries, but not forever. So consider, if you were a Roman senator or general, would you expand endlessly to feed this cycle, knowing the cracks it created? Or would you risk unpopular restraint, curbing expansion to preserve balance? Trajan faced this dilemma knowingly or unknowingly when he incorporated Dacia into Rome. His choice transformed daily lives across two worlds. Thus we see the cultural consequences of military conquest. Integration through assimilation, the misery of slavery, the monotony of garrison life, and the slow erosion of identity for conquered peoples. Victory seemed instant, almost surgical. But the true battle played out in households, marketplaces, temples, and barracks, where the long grind of empire transformed individuals against their will. And yet, this very success concealed dangers. Every province integrated so quickly increased the empire's burden. Every assimilated people increased administrative complexity. As Rome absorbed more, it risked indigestion. The turn from cultural power to strategic strain was coming. And as we now move toward the empire's first cracks, we must ask, how does triumph transform into weakness? At what moment does expansion end, not with glory, but with overextension? That moment, the turning point of Rome's story, awaits. Why do empires fall? Is it defeat on the battlefield, betrayal in the palace, or slow exhaustion from burdens too great to bear? For Rome, the turning point came not from humiliating loss, but from overwhelming victory. When Trajan obliterated Dacia and folded its riches into the empire, it appeared Rome was at its absolute zenith. Yet that very triumph carried hidden consequences. Victory had never felt so complete, and yet the cracks that would one day widen into centuries of decline began to show. The strategic paradox is this: Rome's power depended on conquest, but every conquest made Rome harder to govern. Each new frontier lengthened supply lines, stretched manpower, and demanded loyalty from peoples with no history of allegiance to Rome. Wherever the legions marched, Rome's obligations expanded as quickly as her glory. Dacia illustrates the paradox vividly. At first it seemed a marvel. An entire kingdom turned into a Roman province almost instantly. But absorbing Dacia meant holding mountainous terrain filled with hostile remnants, securing mines that needed constant protection, and maintaining a bridge across the Danube that itself required an army to defend. Rome's appetite for resources was sated, but its stomach was now uncomfortably full. Consider the soldier's perspective. The legionary who once dreamed of returning home after 16 years' service now found himself stationed permanently in frontier garrisons. Local unrest continued. Dacian resistance did not vanish overnight. Guerrilla bands still lurked in forests. Soldiers rotated endlessly through patrols, weary of campaigning that offered neither finality nor rest. Though the empire broadcast its annihilation of the kingdom, on the ground the reality was ongoing. Rome was stuck in a region that required constant vigilance. Meanwhile, the flood of Dacian gold strained the Roman economy in unexpected ways. Gold poured into the treasury so rapidly that the value of coinage destabilized. Prices rose, markets shifted, and corruption spread as elite Romans scrambled to claim their share. One senator's estate could multiply overnight, while small landholders watched inflation erode their modest wealth. Suddenly, Rome was both richer and less stable. Victory's glitter hid the hollowing of economic balance. And within the Senate, jealousy fermented. Victories made Trajan godlike. But as earlier emperors had learned, godlike power breeds mortal resentment. By showing he could erase kingdoms overnight, Trajan inadvertently reminded Rome's aristocrats that he could erase their influence as well. Political intrigue simmered. Public flattery concealed private worry. A poisoned chalice had been handed to the Senate, celebrate the emperor's glory, or risk being seen as traitors to the popular conqueror. Either choice deepened divisions inside Rome's ruling elite. One vivid story illustrates these fractures. The case of Marcus Ulpius Servianus, Trajan's brother-in-law and loyal supporter. He basked in the emperor's victories. Yet other aristocrats saw him as overly favored, an instrument of Trajan's dominance. Dacian spoils enriched his power base while rivals gnawed at their indignities. In Rome, even loyalty could sow resentment, and Dacia provided the resources to make loyalists intimidating to others. Thus, politics edged toward quiet rivalries, waiting for opportunity. Meanwhile, in the broader empire, conquest fatigue was spreading. Veterans returning from campaigns brought back stories of endless war, harsh winters in foreign lands, and the emperor's insatiable appetite for expansion. Families grieved losses long obscured by triumphal parades. Local Italian farms increasingly relied on slave labor, undermining free peasants' chances at survival. The very foundation of Rome's citizen-soldier ethos, the idea that ordinary men earned status through service, was corroding as war became constant and rewards uneven. From the point of view of conquered peoples, Rome's so-called assimilation masked bitterness. Dacians, forced into Roman towns, paid taxes to their conquerors and sent sons into Roman auxiliary service. To resist was suicide, but to comply meant complicity in their kingdom's erasure. Such compromise created simmering tension, resentment bottled but never destroyed, a smoldering ember awaiting future upheavals. Strategically, why did this matter? Because Rome wasn't merely holding Dacia, it was simultaneously shoring up frontiers in Britain, garrisoning the Rhine, contesting along the Euphrates with Parthia, and pacifying unrest in North Africa. The further Rome expanded, the thinner its military fabric stretched. One general put it bluntly, "We can hold the world, but at what cost?" To maintain discipline and cohesion across dozens of provinces demanded bureaucracy as extensive as the army itself. Administration grew heavy, corruption multiplied, loyalty shifted from republic ideals to whoever controlled salaries. Trajan himself, restless and ambitious, soon looked eastward after crushing Dacia. The victories emboldened him to attempt further conquest. Mesopotamia. Once again, glory abroad carried shadows at home. Rome could no longer separate ambition from necessity. Expansion was required to fund the very empire expansion had created. In this cycle lay the beginnings of collapse. Yet within this strategic unraveling stood personal stories of those caught in the turning tide. Imagine a veteran centurion, hardened after 40 years, who expected retirement land grants in Italy, but now discovered his destiny was in a Dacian colony. There, surrounded by hostile locals, he plowed soil still bitter with memories of conquest. His dream of Italian peace turned into a frontier exile. Multiply this by thousands, and the Romanization of provinces begins to look less like choice and more like forced settlement. Or consider a Dacian noble once loyal to Decebalus, his family enslaved, his properties seized. To survive, he accepted Roman citizenship. He sent his son into an auxiliary cohort, where the boy learned Latin drill calls and forgot his ancestral prayers. On the surface, it looked like integration, but in his heart smoldered a wound, a silent conviction that Rome had destroyed his people's soul. Historians often focus on what Rome built, but here we glimpse what it broke. Archaeological evidence sharpens the contrast. Treasure hoards buried hastily in Dacia often remain hidden, their owners likely killed before they could retrieve them. Abandoned sanctuaries show where rituals halted suddenly, never revived. These ruins whisper the unintended consequences of empire. When you erase kingdoms, you erase memories, too. And sometimes what you erase leaves a vacuum not easily filled. From the perspective of modern strategic analysis, Rome's Dacian conquest can be compared to overextensions seen in later superpowers. Acquire territory too fast, and you burden your logistics. Fill your coffers with sudden wealth, and you destabilize existing balances. Celebrate absolute victories, and you alienate allies who fear your unchecked power. The turning point for Rome arises not when enemies finally overwhelm her, but when her victories ignite unsolvable contradictions inside her structure. And here lies the tragic genius of Trajan's era. He was called Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. And in many ways, he governed effectively, expanded wisely, and embodied Roman virtues. Yet by pushing Rome to its geographic height, he also nudged it toward inevitable vulnerability. His Dacian triumph sowed hunger for yet more expansion. His spoils raised expectations of endless victories. His personal dominance unbalanced senatorial politics. As one commentator centuries later put it, the moment Rome appeared strongest was when her decline had quietly begun. Let us end this section by framing the dilemma as a question. If you were Rome, would you have stopped after Dacia, consolidated cooled ambitions, strengthened internal structures? Or, intoxicated by success, would you have reached further, convinced that your machine could run forever at full throttle? History tells us what Rome chose. Trajan marched east, chasing new horizons, convinced he could extend glory infinitely. But in that decision lay the truth. No empire, however ruthless, however disciplined, can outrun the weight of its own victories. The turning point, then, was not a single battle lost, not an army annihilated, not even an emperor slain. It was the invisible moment after supreme triumph, when the victory at Sarmizegetusa shifted from blessing to burden. From that moment forward, Rome was living on borrowed momentum. And as we step into the next stage of our story, we move from the turning of the tide to the consequences themselves. The unraveling threads of economy, politics, and culture that reveal how this glorious war reshaped not only Rome at its height, but the very trajectory of Western history. What happens after you erase a kingdom overnight? Glory and wealth may surge in the short term, but history cares less about temporary brilliance than about what endures. Rome's conquest of Dacia reshaped not merely a region, but the trajectory of the empire and, eventually, the DNA of Europe itself. In the clash of Trajan and Decebalus, we glimpsed not just a spectacular victory, but a constellation of consequences, some triumphant, others haunting, that echo even today. The most immediate result was wealth. Wealth on a scale Rome had seldom seen. Vast Dacian gold and silver mines fell under imperial control. Ancient writers tell of bullion shipments flowing into Rome so abundantly that state debts evaporated, and Trajan enjoyed unprecedented freedom to embark on monumental building projects. The spoils funded the construction of Trajan's Forum and the magnificent markets attached to it, architectural marvels that dazzled contemporaries as the Walmart of the ancient world, a complex that symbolized imperial abundance. But this avalanche of treasure cut two ways. Yes, it fueled prosperity, but it also disrupted Rome's economy. Suddenly, the state possessed more coin than markets could absorb efficiently. Inflation crept upward, distorting wages and prices. Senators and equestrians closest to imperial contracts grew yet richer, while smallholders struggled. As with many empires throughout history, sudden wealth did not distribute evenly. For some, Dacia was the gift of fortune. For others, it deepened dependency and inequality. The conquest also reshaped the demographic map of the region. Roman colonists poured into newly pacified Dacia. Veterans settled on farms granted as rewards for long service, planting roots in foreign soil. Traders from Italy and the Balkans arrived to exploit resources. Roads carved through mountains bound the province into Rome's communications network. Within a generation, Dacia transformed from independent kingdom to Roman heartland beyond the Danube. Archaeological remains, Latin inscriptions, amphitheaters, bathhouses, coins stamped with Trajan's head, testified to this colonization. Long-term, these settlements had extraordinary cultural consequences. The Latin language took hold so deeply that its echo reverberates into the present. Romanian, the modern language spoken in that land, is a Romance tongue, cousin to Italian and Spanish, a direct descendant of the integration sparked by Trajan's conquest. Few Roman wars left such a clear linguistic and cultural legacy. Thus, in the survival of language alone, Dacia shaped Europe for millennia after its political annihilation. Strategically, the conquest seemed to secure the frontier. By placing legions north of the Danube, Rome projected dominance where earlier emperors had retreated. Trajan's bridge, symbol of mastery over nature, declared permanent presence. But permanence is costly. Holding mountainous Dacia required garrisons, roads, and continual vigilance against hostile tribes pressing on the province's edges. In stabilizing one frontier, Rome created new vulnerabilities. When pressure later mounted along the Rhine and in the east, the decision to maintain Dacia appeared far less glorious. Some later emperors debated abandoning the territory altogether, recognizing that the glitter of Trajan's great prize masked a drain Rome could ill afford. Yet culturally, the conquest produced striking duality. Dacia vanished as a sovereign kingdom, but Rome immortalized its enemy in stone. Trajan's column spirals with panels depicting Dacians with dignity, their faces individualized, their bravery acknowledged. Rome erased them politically but artistically enshrined them forever. This paradox reveals much about Roman psychology: admiration bound up with annihilation, respect emerging only when the opponent was safely dead. The consequences extended further still. Rome's demonstration of absolute ruthlessness reverberated through surrounding tribes. Germanic chieftains, Sarmatian horsemen, and others along the frontier now viewed Rome both with fear and with burning resentment. Defy us, and you will share Dacia's fate. Such was the message Trajan broadcast. And yet, precisely by instilling fear, Rome locked itself into permanent confrontation. Fear does not disappear. It festers, inspiring unity among enemies who might otherwise have remained divided. Tribes that once quarreled with each other found precedent in Dacia's destruction to form coalitions against the empire. For the Senate and people of Rome, the empire's victory had profound political meaning. Trajan's popularity soared. Public works exalted the emperor as benevolent provider. Grain dole distributions expanded, funded by Dacian wealth. Gladiatorial spectacles splashed with Dacian captives armed for hopeless struggles in the arena thrilled the mob. The people equated victory with prosperity, but the precedent was dangerous. By tying Rome's domestic stability to foreign spoils, imperial leadership trapped itself in expectations of perpetual conquest. What happens when expansion slows? When no more Dacias exist to plunder? That question would soon haunt Rome. On a symbolic level, the annihilation of a kingdom reinforced, almost brutally, Rome's identity as destiny itself. Conquered territories were not just absorbed, they were rewritten. Thrones toppled, temples replaced, languages altered. Rome's message was simple: resist us and you will be extinguished. To Roman citizens, this bolstered pride, confirming their divine mandate to rule the known world. To Rome's enemies, it cemented enduring hatred. Archaeology illuminates more subtle impacts. Excavations at Sarmizegetusa reveal Roman rebuilding directly atop Dacian sacred spaces, proclaiming continuity of land but rupture of identity. Clay tablets recording tax collection display the speed of Roman bureaucracy, evidence of integration achieved within years. Conversely, Dacian exile communities left artifacts far afield, scattered ornaments, weapons given new inscriptions. Testaments of diaspora created by conquest. These shards remind us that consequences of war are not only material, but emotional. They are inscribed in memory as much as in stone. From a modern strategic lens, Rome's conquest of Dacia illustrates core lessons. First, overwhelming force achieves swift results, but the costs of occupation can endure far longer than battles. Second, sudden access to wealth destabilizes as much as it empowers. Third, annihilation as policy generates acclaim in the short term, but fosters perpetual resentment in the long term. Leaders across centuries, from Napoleon to colonial powers, would encounter these same paradoxes. Victory is simple. Managing victory is complex. Consider, too, the personal consequences for Trajan himself. His reputation soared, earning him the title Optimus Princeps. His monuments celebrated him not as conqueror alone, but as benefactor. And yet, this raised the standard impossibly high. What could follow the annihilation of a kingdom? Only more conquests of equal magnitude. And so, inexorably, Trajan looked east, preparing wars against Parthia. Without Dacia's triumph, perhaps his ambitions would have stayed within limits. With it, he was compelled to chase immortality. Thus, the conquest created momentum Rome couldn't slow, a treadmill of expansion. For the conquered, assimilation stretched across generations. The children of Dacians, raised under Latin law, grew to think of themselves as Romans first. Yet faint memories smoldered in folklore and legend, stories of a king who defied Rome to the end. Victory obliterates armies, but it never entirely wipes memory. Many centuries later, medieval chroniclers and modern Romanians alike would reclaim Decebalus as a symbol of resistance. Ironically, Rome's attempt to erase a kingdom ensured it endured mythically far longer than politically. The broad historical impact is staggering. By incorporating Dacia, Rome extended Latin culture across Eastern Europe. By demonstrating ruthless annihilation, the empire signaled both strength and fragility. Invincible in battle, but increasingly dependent on victories for survival. And by flooding its system with unexpected wealth, Rome bloomed luxuriously for a season while sowing long-term instability. Thus, we see consequences at multiple levels. Strategic, the frontier permanently lengthened. Economic, inflation and inequality increased. Cultural, Latin roots embedded themselves across Europe. Political, the Senate eroded, the emperor glorified, rivals silenced. Personal, soldiers grinded through endless garrisons. Conquered peoples saw their world vanish. Rome's citizens found themselves hooked on a diet of foreign spoils. Ask yourself this: was Rome stronger the day after Sarmizegetusa fell, or already weaker? Stronger in wealth, prestige, and pride, undeniably, but weaker in balance, sustainability, and restraint. Empires rarely recognize the moment power passes from stable to unstable. It often happens in silence, beneath the roar of triumphal parades. The story of Dacia shows us this paradox. Rome conquered with ruthless efficiency, secured riches beyond measure, immortalized the victory in stone, and inscribed its culture onto the soil. Yet in so doing, it yoked itself to endless conquest, stretched its ability to govern, and inspired eternal resentment. The consequences remind us that victory may be dazzling, but history always waits to reveal the bill. And as we march into our final section, we pivot from antiquity into reflection. What does this story tell us today? How do the lessons of an empire that erased kingdoms overnight speak to modern powers, modern politics, modern strategies? Rome's monuments still stand. Its consequences still echo. Now we must weigh their relevance, both haunting and instructive, for our own age. Why remember the fall of a forgotten kingdom, erased almost 2,000 years ago? Why linger on Trajan's bridge, his column, his conquest of Dacia? The answer lies not in nostalgia, but in recognition. The mechanics of power, the costs of empire, and the fragile balance between triumph and restraint have not changed. The legions are gone, but the lessons they left remain. Rome's systematic annihilation of Dacia reveals the DNA of empire itself. First, victory built upon preparation, engineering, logistics, discipline. Rome did not win by chance. It won by ensuring that chance had little room to matter. This is as true today as it was then. Nations that prepare comprehensively often win without needing to gamble. Yet preparation comes at a price: the weight of infrastructure, bureaucracy, and expectation. Second, the conquest illustrates the paradoxical nature of success. Trajan destroyed a kingdom overnight. In doing so, he enshrined his reputation as the Optimus Princeps. But he also shackled Rome to a cycle of conquest. Victories fed the economy, fed the people's expectations, fed the Senate's suspicion, and fed the emperor's ambition. Each triumph made the next one imperative. Modern superpowers face the same treadmill: deliver prosperity through projection of strength, then maintain that prosperity through more projection. When does momentum become obligation? When does obligation become burden? Third, Dacia's fall exposes the human cost behind marble triumphs. For every statue of Trajan, there were thousands of anonymous captives. For every relief of legionaries advancing in perfect formation, there were slaves laboring in mines pulled from their families. Victories are remembered through monuments. Losses are remembered only in silence. The archaeologist's shovel, uncovering shackles, temples turned to ruins, and treasure hoards never reclaimed, reminds us that ancient headlines concealed countless personal tragedies. In this sense, Rome teaches humility. Behind every triumph lies a ledger of suffering. Fourth, cultural legacy. Rome thought it annihilated Dacia, but in truth it transformed it. Latin roots planted in those mountains sprouted into enduring cultural identity. Romanian today is spoken because of Rome's colonization. In the very act of erasure, Rome created continuity. Empires rarely foresee which legacies endure. They intend monuments. History preserves languages. They seek glory. Posterity finds culture. Strategically, Rome's conquest asks us a timeless question. Do you rule through annihilation or through integration? Trajan chose annihilation, then assimilation. For generations, Rome could ride that balance. Yet over time, the cycle strained the empire's limits. Modern states face similar dilemmas. Subdue, assimilate, reconcile, or annihilate. The choice defines not only their enemy's fate, but their own. Consider, too, the politics of glory. Senators feared Trajan's triumph, jealous of his supremacy. Rome's internal stability trembled precisely because external success magnified imbalance at home. This is a recurrent theme across eras. Victories abroad cannot mend divisions within. They often worsen them. When external conquest is sought to mask domestic discontent, decline usually follows. And finally, look at the archaeology of memory. Trajan's column still stands, a spiral of propaganda carved in marble. It shows Rome at her strongest, legions advancing irresistibly, enemies dying nobly but inevitably. Yet even as it praises Rome, it unwittingly preserves the memory of Dacians. The victors controlled the narrative, but the vanquished live on in those very stone panels. Modern powers too should reflect. Propaganda outlives context. Monuments outlast intentions. What we carve to glorify ourselves may one day be read as warning, not triumph. So what does Dacia's fall teach us? That conquest is easy, control is hard. That overwhelming success can conceal fragility. That the erasure of others becomes paradoxically the foundation of new identities. That empires feed on victories until the appetite exceeds capacity. And that human drama, ambition, pride, desperation, suffering remains constant, whether in the Carpathian forests of 106 CE or in the corridors of power today. We began with the image of a legion slipping silently into position as dawn rose over a kingdom destined to vanish. We end with a truth no army could erase. Rome's victories did not last forever, but the consequences did. The Dacians disappeared as a state, but their land, their descendants, and their culture continued, reshaped under Roman imprint. Rome thought it had ended a story. In fact, it had written a new one, and so we are left with a question that reverberates across ages. When power achieves its ultimate triumph, what price is hidden within it? Rome, the empire that erased kingdoms overnight, could not erase the cost of its success. That is the enduring lesson, whispered among ruins, etched into marble, spoken in the survival of language. For modern leaders, historians, and citizens, the warning endures. Victories may make us marvel, but consequences shape us forever. Rome teaches us to measure not only what is gained in conquest, but what is promised, what is burdened, and what is ultimately lost.